Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, person invested in publishing and such, and today I'm going to be talking about writing with a pen name, or to use the fancy term, pseudonym. This video is part of a series of writing-related Ask Me Anything type videos that were suggested by people who have watched my other videos. So thanks to Joe who sent in this question about writing under pen names. So let's start from the beginning. I'm going to personalize this as much as I can to make it clear. I always introduce myself on these videos as AJ Hartley, but if you look at the channel title, it'll say Andrew Hartley. Why? Because the YouTube channel is attached to my academic affiliation, and as a scholar, I have always published as Andrew James Hartley. And people call me different things depending on how they know me. I have a lot of friends in the writing community, people I've known for many years, who call me AJ, because that's how they know me. At school, amongst my colleagues, my fellow professors, I would be called Andrew. Publishers in academic fields call me Andrew James Hartley. Students call me Professor Hartley, Dr. Hartley, because I have a PhD. So all of these things represent, people I used to play football with call me Andy because I grew up in Northern England and that's what happens. All of these things represent different facets of my identity. I publish fiction mostly as AJ Hartley, but if you've read books like this, you'll also know that I publish as Andrew Hart. So let's talk about how those things happened, how my various identities got different name tags, what the point of that is, what the value of it is, what potential problems there might be for it, so that you can think about if, as a writer, you want to publish under a different name. Now, let's begin by saying the writer doesn't always have a choice. My first novel was The Mask of Atreus, and it centered on a Jewish woman who was an archaeologist, which I am not. And the book was published by Penguin, and they notified me one day that the name on the book would be AJ Hartley. An editorial decision had been made that they didn't want to draw attention to the disconnect between male author and female protagonist. AJ was neutral. Plenty of writers have done this before. J.K. Rowling is an obvious example. George Eliot was a female novelist who used a male name in order to get published at a time when it was harder for women writers to be taken seriously. So, this is a long-standing literary issue. This was my first novel. I had no track record. If the publisher, this was Penguin, said, we think this, could potentially harm sales or otherwise create a barrier between what the reader's expectations are and what you're actually delivering. So this is what we want to do. That means there'll be no bio, no author bio on the book. There'll be no headshot, no photograph on the back or inside the cover or anything like that. You're AJ Hartley, at least for this book. That, of course, becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you have published under that name, you need a good reason to not publish under that name. So even though my next novel had a male protagonist, the publisher wanted to keep the AJ Hartley name. We didn't seriously consider changing it because now I had a track record. Now I had people who had read the first book who might want to read the second. And the second book was of the same type. These were archaeological mystery thrillers. Right, so we went from Mask of Atreus, which had a female protagonist, to On the Fifth Day, which had a male protagonist, but they were both published as AJ Hartley books. A few years later, when I started publishing fantasy, my first novel came out with Tor that was called Act of Will, and we had a conversation with the publisher where I said, do you want me to use a different name? And because this is one of the reasons that people use multiple pseudonyms or make a change within their publishing career, right? That if people associate a certain kind of book with you and then you publish something radically different, it can confuse the market. So I offered to publish my fantasy under another name, and Tor said no. They said, we want the possibility of crossover from thriller, which is largely a bigger market. They sell more books in thriller, and we want that market to find your fantasy stuff. Whether they did or not is another question. This is a real historical concern. The market has changed a lot in the last 20 years. People used to buy books only pretty much in physical stores, right? And if your book was shelved in one section, in fantasy, say, and you had other books in the mystery section, people literally wouldn't find them. Because often people who are looking to buy a genre book are only in one section of the store. They wouldn't walk over to the other section to find your book. So those books would not be shelved together, even if they were under the same name. People who read and liked my mystery thrillers may not have known that my fantasy books even existed, even though they were published under the same name. Now, as I say, the market has changed now, and the fact that so much shopping happens online has changed that dynamic. That anything that appears under the same author name on Amazon or whatever internet site you might look at to either browse or actually purchase books will group every book, regardless of genre, together under that one name. So this leads us to an obvious question. Do you want to have all your books, regardless of genre, listed under the same name or not? One of the reasons that people choose to diversify their publishing names is because the material that they publish was different. As I said, The Woman in Our House came out with Lake Union, and they specifically said, because you have been publishing a lot of fantasy, a lot of young adult, we want to create a kind of firewall between that material and this, which is a contemporary realist suspense novel. Actually close to where I started, but I had published so many other things by the time these came out that they said, we want to come up with a different name. And we kicked around a few possibilities, and I think in the end, they chose that. They chose Andrew Hart, which is close to mine, and there's no attempt to keep my identity secret. If you look at the copyright page, which we should talk about in a second, it says, written, there's books written as AJ Hartley. And the copyright page itself, in this case, actually it says text by Andrew James Hartley, which is, as I said, that's the name under which I publish my scholarly books. It's my legal name. There's no attempt to hide my identity from anybody who's trying to find out about it. The decision to call me Andrew Hart on those books was simply a marketing decision. It's not an attempt at actual secrecy. Now, of course, some writers genuinely really do want actual secrecy. This may be about the kind of books you publish in other areas. It may just be about life, If you are known primarily as a children's book writer, for example, when you start publishing your, dark vampire fiction or erotica, something radically different from children's books, which could tarnish your reputation, rightly or wrongly, which could have an impact, a negative impact on your identity as a writer of children's books, then you are absolutely going to need another identity under which to write, because otherwise it gets confusing, it gets messy, and it can be potentially damaging. If somebody who just buys all your stuff because they know your name, they really like your stuff, and then you start delivering things that are very, very different from what they expect, maybe they will like that, but there's a good chance they won't. If they're looking for you for one kind of thing and you're delivering something else, that can be a problem. So that's an obvious case. Now, as I say, that doesn't just apply to you publishing in different areas. It may be that you want to create that kind of firewall between your creative identity and your life, depending on your job, your family, your whatever, your status within your local community or your church or whatever. The kind of things that you produce as a creative writer might not be things that you want people to know about. I don't mean there's anything shameful about it, but certain businesses and companies will look skeptically on fictional stuff that isn't precisely in line with their company mission, say, right? You don't have to be a pastor or something for that to be a problem. I just came back from the Shakespeare Association of America annual conference in Boston, and I was in a seminar on Shakespeareans who were also creatives, and the conversation was all about how our academic identities shape our creative output, and vice versa, and so on, those kinds of issues. And it was a great seminar. One of the things that came up was this sort of pervasive sense of anxiety and embarrassment about creative writing and other forms of artistic production, which people were anxious about their universities not liking, not valuing. And it was a really interesting thing. And I have, for example, writer friends who I've known for many years who are very successful scholars, but also very successful creative writers. And they kept those two identities deliberately separate because they were afraid that the fact that they were, for example, romance novelists might be considered to somehow lessen their seriousness as academics. Now, of course, ultimately, academia has changed a lot in the last quarter century. And as a lot of English departments and their literary offerings have contracted, the one area which seems to be really booming is creative writing. Universities are constantly looking to justify their existence for good and not so good reasons. But, if you're a successful novelist, say, reaching large numbers of people, that is now considered an asset by a lot of universities. And they're happy to champion that as part of their faculty identity. But that wasn't always the case. And I think it's understandable that sometimes people, particularly when they're starting out, say, I'm going to keep this quiet until it is successful. And then I can wheel it out as a sort of fait accompli, say, look, this is a done thing, and I'm proud of it, and it's successful, and it actually gives me reach and visibility. Impact and visibility are the watchwords of a lot of academic production. These are the things that come up in annual review and tenure reviews and so on. My novels have impact and visibility, right, in ways that my academic books don't. My academic books are written for other academics, and they're going to sell a very small number, mostly to university libraries. They become part of a very small conversation that gets cited throughout academic publications, but that's a very small section of the population. So the idea of a novel that might sell 100,000, 200,000 copies to the general public is something that universities often value. So, my identities started to fuse. They still got published under different names. I'm Andrew James Hartley as a scholar, AJ Hartley or Andrew Hart as a novelist. But I don't have to sort of maintain an absolute distinction, especially now since I am retired. I'm an emeritus professor. So I don't have to worry about maintaining that sort of distinction. But until I was published, the fact that I was writing fiction was something I kept quiet. And it was only after the fact, it was a few years after the fact, when I went up for full professor, that I sort of started talking about it publicly as part of my academic and professional identity. So, as I say, one of the reasons that you might want to keep these things secret is that you don't want them to bleed over into different parts of your life that don't necessarily obviously benefit from being touched by the other. What are the downsides of writing under multiple names? Well, as I say, you become harder to find. The old idea that I mentioned before about physical bookstores separating you by genre is still true, even on online platforms, if you're writing under different names and you're not deliberately making connections between those two names. If you are publishing fantasy novels under one name and romance under another name, then there may not be a lot of crossover. Now, as I said, maybe you have reasons to want that firewall between the two, but it also is likely to impact your overall sales. I hate to always bring things back to sales, but sales are how we measure, again, impact and visibility. It's not about making money, it's about reach. So if you have two sets of things going on simultaneously, but there's no connection between them, then the people in this group are not necessarily going to find the stuff over here. Maybe they wouldn't anyway, maybe they wouldn't be interested in it, but if I'm writing mystery and thriller under different names, there's a lot of overlap between those two audiences, and often books will span both. A lot of my books are both mystery and thriller simultaneously, right? So maintaining a separation there would not make sense. But in other cases, maybe it would. And I'm losing audience by keeping separate identities. I said that I would say something about copyright, so let me just say this. In the US and in many places, copyright is immediate on the completion of a product. The moment you do anything with it, the moment you finalize it in any way, you have copyright. You can go through a process of registering the copyright, which strengthens your legal claim, but for the most part, you don't actually need to do that because on the moment of publication, that copyright is considered guaranteed, unless, of course, you have plagiarized the material or something like that. But as far as copyright is concerned, you can register your copyright under a pseudonym. You don't have to declare your legal name on the book itself. You may want to do that on the paperwork for copyright to make sure that they have a correspondence address and so on, that it will actually reach you. But you don't have to put your legal name on the book if you want to keep it quiet. The other thing, of course, is whether you want your multiple identities to be linked in cyberspace. And the obvious way to do that is by gathering them together on a single website or on your Amazon author page. Again, you can have multiple Amazon author pages or multiple websites, you have to pay for them, of course, under different pseudonyms, or you can yoke them all together under a single one. And of course, you can always put your website address on your book. I have no great desire to keep my various writing identities separate. So for me, that's just marketing. It's about general association and it's about what publishers want from me, but I'm not keeping them secret. So my website connects all my books regardless of what name they are published under. And I guess that's it. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out, of course, my books under my various names. Check out my Patreon page, and special thanks to all my patrons who make this channel, which is non-monetized because it's associated with my identity as an academic, as a state employee, and therefore cannot be monetized. My patrons make this channel possible, so thank you. That's all. Check out my Dashery store, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.